We'll start here on Daf of Gimel Amid Aleph with Rabbana Lemute, etc. And Bli Neder, we'll go back to finish up what we started in the Yalkut HaBi'urim. So let's just see where we're up to here on Daf Chav Gimel Amid Aleph. We're in the first part of Daf Gimel Chav Gimel Amid Aleph. V'Rabbanon. See, how do we, is there an easy way of, which Tosfos would be good? Ve'i? Ve'i, the one that starts Ve'i? The one below it. The fourth Tosfos on the page, Kasava. Okay. V'Rabbanon. You see, it's kind of like a little bit above that Tosfos, like slightly above. So the Gemara asks the following. And again, this is the question that we've been having a lot of trouble with, but we're hoping that somewhere there'll be a light at the end of the tunnel. Rabbana Lemeute Shivcha Ve'ovedes Kochav Minol. We're talking about the erva of Achoso, and here's a case where the father had a relationship with a Shivcha or an Ovedes Kochavim, and from that relationship, a girl was born, a daughter was born, and the question is whether or not that girl is included in the erva of Achosa. And Rabbi Yossi had derived that conclusion from the extra words of Achoso he, but the Rabbanon don't have that drasha. And now, if we need that pasuk to be mechayev bal Achoso, that in the case of Baal HaChosar, he has an additional violation. Besides the Erev of HaChosar, he has also a violation of the Erev of Baal Bas Eshes Aviv. So he doesn't have the superfluous, the extra words of HaChosar to exclude as a miut the case of HaChosar that was born from a Shivcha Vodas Kochav. So where do we derive that conclusion from? And the Gemara answers, Nafkale, the Chachamim are going to derive it from a different drasha. And now we turn to the parsha of Eved Ivri, which is in Parshas Mishpat. And a Jew was sold as an Eved Ivri. Normally, we don't sell a Jew as an Eved, but let's say, for example, he was guilty of theft and he couldn't pay back the theft and return the money. So in order to earn that money that he should be able to pay the nigzav, we will sell him as an Eved Ivri. And in such a case, the Torah permits the Adon to marry off the Eved Ivri to a Shivcha. However, the Torah says that if there are children that are born from that relationship between the Eved Ivri and the Shivcha during the period of his Avdus, then those children are, so to speak, owned by the Adon. And when the Eved finishes his stay, let's say after 6 years, and he terminates his Avdus, then he goes out of the possession of his Adon. He now becomes a free agent. However, ha'isha v'yoladea tia ladonel. The children get left behind. And they belong, so to speak, to the Adon. Now, what does this imply? Meaning, what is the underlying halachic legal principle to the fact that Isha v'yoladea tia ladonel? And the answer is that there's no yichus to the father, meaning the Eved, but rather the yichus is now to the mother. And the mother's a shivcha. So the children have the same status as their mother. This is a very unique, unusual halacha within the constellation of the laws of Yuchsin. You know, there's a whole parak in Kiddushin called Yuchsin. Asar Yuchsin, it's called, right? And in that parak, the yichus is always related to the father. But in this case, where the mother was a shivcha knanis, the yichus is now to the mother, not to the father. So it's unbelievable that the Torah allows the Eved to have this ongoing intimate relationship with the Shivcha, but he has to know that she still remains a Shivcha, and the children have all the dinim of children who are born to a Shivcha. And children who are born to a Shivcha are not miyuchas to the father, they're miyuchas to the mother. So therefore, and I think I'm comfortable to say that the Gemara now is coming very close to what we were saying all along throughout this whole sugya, that you can't call achoso in the case of a girl who's born to a shivcha, or for that matter, for sure, because the yichus here has to be through the father. She's only going to be a sister through the father. Right? They have different mothers. And there's no yichus to the father in the case of a bas shivcha. Because if a man has a relation with a shivcha, the Torah says that the children are miyuchasim to the shivcha, to their mother, not to their father. So it's to what extent can you call her achoso? She's certainly not achoso. So the Gemara is so convinced by the power and the validity, the logic of this derivation, that the Gemara now swings back to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. And by implication, the Gemara is asking the following question: Why does Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda require a special miyut to exclude the case of the daughter of a shivcha from the erev of achoso, from bas eshes aviv? Why not just derive it from the case of ha'isha v'yiladeh, that the child, the achos, the daughter that comes from a shivcha is miyuchas to our mother? So the Gemara answers, chad shivcha v'chad be'ovedes kol chavim. That when we talk about the pasuk of ha'isha v'yiladeh, that's talking about a case of a shivcha. What does that mean? When the Torah allows an Eved Ivri to be, so to speak, married off to a shivcha, that's only a shivcha because she has a quasi status of a giores. Because an Eved and a shivcha, we're talking about Knanim, when they are taken, so to speak, as avodim, then they enter into a quasi-gerus. They don't accept upon themselves all the mitzvahs. Like, for example, a mitzvah seishes mind groma is not incumbent upon an eved, but a certain element of gerus is certainly generated by the avos. So we need one pasuk, and that's ha'isha v'yiladeh, to exclude the case of a shivcha, because to some extent we would have had a havamina in the case of a shivcha, that since the Torah permitted this relationship between the Eved and the shivcha, the Eved Ivri and the shivcha Knanis, the Torah is to some extent recognizing the validity of that marriage, which would allow the yuchsin to go to the father. So we need one pasuk, Isha v'yiladeh tiyal adoneh, to establish that there is no yichus to the father, only to the mother in the case of a shivcha. But now we need an additional pasuk, and that's bas eshes avich, to teach me that if the father had a relationship with a non-Jewish woman in Ovedes Kol Chavim, the child, in this case the daughter, is not achoso, because she's not miyuchas to the father, but rather to the mother. And the Gemara is going to now ask, what's the havamina? You know, it's a kal v'chomer. In the case of a shivcha, there's no yichus to the father. Then certainly there's no yichus to the father in the case of Ovedes Kol Chavim. She's not achoso. Tzricha. Gemara says, no, we need it. And it's going to be interesting because if you're going to tell me that we need it for the case of Ovedes Kol Chavim, and we don't know what would be in the case of the shivcha, and that's why the Torah added ha'isha v'yiladeh tiyal adoneh. So then you could ask the question, why didn't the pasuk why did the Torah just omit the case of Ovedes Kochavim? We would have derived it with a Kavachomer from Shivcha. So Gemara says the Iash Me'inan Shivcha. If the Torah had only told that in the case of a daughter of a Shivcha, she's not considered a sister, and therefore there's no Iser Erva in the case of the daughter of a Shivcha. Shum di Eila Chayes. There's no yichus, meaning there's no yichus to the father, there's only a yichus to the mother. And for sure, she's not a chosa. So again, if there's no yichus in the case of a shivcha, how much more so there should be no yichus in the case of Avodas Kochavim? And the Gemara now is going to drop a bomb that there is yichus in the case of Avodas Kochavim. What does that mean? Avodas Kochavim the Islay Chayes. Now here we have a pasuk which not only Rashi but the Rishonim want to analyze this pasuk. It says in Bereishis Chav Beis in the parsha of the Akedah at the end of Vayera, it says Yeshvu Shvu Lachem Po Im HaChamor. Darshu, and the Gemara Kiddushin derives Am Hadome Lechamor. So what does that mean? Am Hadome Lechamor. He writes here in the note, Yesha Pirshu Sha Torah Kosva Din Zeh Shavodim Heim Kechamorim Dafka B'Parshas Akedah. Okay, fine. That's something else. Can I just borrow your Gemara for a minute? Okay, he has a note here. Let's see if by chance he adds anything. Regarding arayos, idolaters, I would have written non-Jews, have no legal patrilineage, which I think means no yichus to the father. But we do find that children of idolaters, again, children of non-Jews, are genealogically connected to their fathers. And he says, in order to understand and appreciate that, see Daf Samach Beis Amud Aleph. So, if I'm not mistaken, Daf Samach Beis is the famous sugya of Lo So Bra El Sheves Yitzara. And the Gemara wants to know if, let's say, a man had a child when he was a guy and now he converts, whether he's chayv in period of Arivia. The Gemara declares maybe since he was Mekayim the mitzvah of Sheves, and that mitzvah applies even to a non-Jew, therefore, there's some element of yichus going into Gerus, and he already fulfilled the mitzvah period of Arivia. So somehow, the mitzvah of Sheves, which applies even by non-Jews, would generate a kiyum of period of Arivia, or at least a ptur from the chiyuv of period of Arivia after his Gerus. But we derive the conclusion from that sugya that there is a genealogical relationship of yichus within the non-Jewish world between the child and the father. And the Gemara there is going to quote a pasuk in Malachim Beis. It says, Baladan ben Balada, or ben Hadad ben Tobrimon. So in any event, there are cases in which the Tanakh itself calls the son of his father, and we're talking about non-Jews. Okay, now, let's say a Jewish man has a relationship with a non-Jewish woman. So that would create a yichus relationship between the daughter and her father. He says that we might think, therefore, that an idolatress's daughter is sufficiently connected. See, here he writes idolatress, I think is the female. It's referring to the mother, because the father is Jewish. So the father has a relationship with a non-Jewish woman, the daughter is connected to her father. In other words, had he been a non-Jew, she would be miyuchas to her father. And therefore, for the necessity, for what's ever necessary to generate an erev achoso, the fact that the father has a son from a Jewish woman and a daughter from a non-Jewish woman, that yichus to the daughter from a non-Jewish woman is sufficient to create an erev of achoso. That's the Havamina. Let me give this back to you. That was very helpful. And the Gemara now is raising the Havamina that if there would be a yichus to the father in a non-Jewish situation, based on the biological fatherhood, the same thing would apply even in a Jew, even if the father is Jewish. Emolo, maybe achoso would be in place. There would be a valid Iser Erev of achoso. V'yashmin obes kochavim. If we have a mute to exclude Overes Kochavim, meaning that there's no Erev of Achoso in the case of a daughter that's married, that is produced by a non-Jewish mother, and that situation does not generate an Erev of Achoso, we would say that only in that case there's no Erev of Achoso, but if the mother is a Shifcha, there would be an Erev of Achoso, and presumably the reason for that is because the Maskana is that the relationship between a non-Jewish daughter and her non-Jewish father is only because they're both non-Jews. But if the father is Jewish, then he can't have any claim to Yuchsin to the daughter that comes through an Ovedes Kochavim, because she's Mufka, completely excluded from Kedushas Yisrael. But in the case of Shifcha, there's a partial Kedushas Yisrael. Yashminan, Ovedes Kochavim. There, the Erev of Achoso from Ovedes Kochavim was excluded. Mishum Lo Shaichem B'Mitzvahs. Okay, Lo Shaichem B'Mitzvahs means that an Ovedes Kochavim is Mufka from Kedushas Yisrael. Well, Shifcha the Shaichem B'Mitzvahs. Right, a shivcha like an Eved has mitzvahs, not all the mitzvahs, but at least the mitzvahs that are lavsman groma. Lo. Now I would say that through the shivcha, if not for the pasuk hu v'yoladerti eladonea, there would be enough kedushas Yisrael in the shivcha such that the child of the shivcha, in this case a daughter, would be miyuchas to her father, her Jewish father, such that the son would be prohibited from a relationship with his sister under the erva of achoso, and therefore tzricha, I need the pasuk of hu v'yoladerti ladon. Now, in the case of Shivcha, the Torah says in Parshas Kedoshim, it says, so the word law is used for Gzeira Shava to Isha. Because in the parsha, in Kitese of Get, it says, because of law, Sefer Krisa. So the Gemara at the beginning of Chagiga presents a Gzeira Shava law mi Isha. That just like in Shivcha, the Torah used the word law, so too Isha, a Jewish woman, is called law, and therefore the Shivcha, and the Eved as well, has the same status as an Isha with regard to mitzvah say she'ena zman groma, and a Ptur in the case of zman groma. But in any event, we see clearly that a Shivcha has Kedushas Yisrael, and we were vacillating back and forth, having the maskana, whether or not that element or that level of Kedushas Yisrael is enough to generate Yuchsin. And we thought in a Havmin it would, and therefore there'd be an Erev Achoso, Kamach Malan. The Pasuk is teaching me no, that a Shivcha still, as far as Yuchsin is concerned, has the status of a nochris. She doesn't have sufficient kedushas Yisrael to generate yuchsa. This reminds me, by the way, of a very famous Shita Mekubetzes with regard to a ger who hasn't yet his korban. So he had Mila and Tefillah, but he didn't have what's called Hartzah's Dam. He didn't bring his korban. And the Shita Mekubetzes says that he's not allowed to marry a Jewish girl until he brings his korban. The Gemara itself increases, asks, so how do we allow gerim b'zman hazeh? I mean, they can marry Jewish girls. So the Gemara says, the pasuk says l'dor sechem. So again, if there's a possibility the mikdash is standing and the ger could bring his korban, then until he brings his korban, according to the Shita Mekubetzes, he's not allowed to marry a Jewish girl. Also level a call till he brings his korban. Today we don't have the mikdash, so gerus is complete even without a korban. I'm wondering out loud, what would be, according to Shita Mekubetzes, in a ger ma'ukav korban, he hasn't yet brought his korban during the time of the mikdash, and he went ahead and he married a Jewish girl. He shouldn't have done so, but he did. Would the child be biyuchas achra? And I would suggest that perhaps we could compare, according to Shita Mekubetzes, a ger ma'ukav korban to a shivcha, to an eved, meaning that there would not be any yichus because his gerus is incomplete. Or asks the Rabbanon who say that the pasuk bas eishes ovid is not superfluous. We're going to derive the additional iser erva in the case of achoso under the additional category of eishes ovid from the pasuk bas eishes ovid is ashkachan shivcha veres kochavim minolet. Now that you've told me we need two psukim, one to exclude achoso in the case of a shivcha, and that we derived from and then we had another pasuk to exclude achoso min veres kochavim. And that was good according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, who derived it from Eishes, Bas Eishes Avicha. But now the Chachamim need the pasuk of Bas Eishes Avicha to generate an additional Iser Erva in the case of Achoso. So how are they going to derive the conclusion that Achoso Me'avaris Kachavim is not included in the Erva of Achoso? V'chi Tema, and if you'll say Neilus Mishivcha, that we can't say because Hana Mitzvah Tzricha, we just went through an entire logical analysis of why we need both Shivcha and an exclusion of both Shivcha and Ovedes Kol Chavim. Like where it says on Rabbi Yochanan Mitzvah Reb Shimba Yochai. We're going to derive this din of Ovedes Kol Chavim from a different source. So the Masechet gives a little bit of a background. He says when Klal Yisrael entered into Eretz Yisrael, the Torah warned them that they should not marry the children, the banim or the banos of the goyim that occupied Eretz Yisrael. It says, "Bitcha lo siten libno, uvito lo sikach livnecha." And the Torah says that it's prohibited to marry off a son or a daughter to an ovedes kochav. Omar Kra, the Torah says, why is it prohibited to marry an ovedes kochavim? Because ki yasir es bincha me'acharad. If you marry off your son to a non-Jewish woman, then yasir es bincha me'acharad. And I think what's going on here is that the children from that marriage, if you marry off your son to a non-Jewish woman, are not miyuchas to your son, and therefore they're not your grandchildren. Now, it's very interesting. the case here is bincha. Do you see that pasuk? It says ki yoser is bincha me'acharav. So it means you are marrying off your son to a non-Jewish girl. Now let's take the flip case. What about your daughter? Marrying off your daughter to a non-Jewish man. So in that case, the children from that marriage will be Jewish because the religion is miyuchas basar ha'em. So that's why it doesn't say in the pasuk, bitcha lo sitein libno, don't marry off your daughter to their sons, meaning the sons of those goyim. Bincha Yisrael is kari bincha. It must be that if you marry off your daughter, chas v'shalom, to a non-Jewish man, then the child of that marriage is still considered your ben. And there is yichus, because in that case, the yichus is through the mother. However, ein bincha abba ben alveres kochavim kari bincha lebino. That if you marry off your son to a non-Jewish woman, then the child of that marriage is not your ben, because there's no yichus through an overes kochavim. Again, the Torah is not at least explicitly concerned about marrying off your daughter to a non-Jewish man under the Tosser as bincha, because it's not going to be Tosser as bincha because the child from that marriage is a Jew, whereas in the case of marrying off your son to a non-Jewish woman, there the child is Yasir as bincha because he's going to be a god. I mean, halachically, he's a god. And the yichus in that case is through the mother. So mikan lamdu chachamim shekshem sheben abami avodas kochavim misyaches acharel v'lo achrei baila hayisrael. So in a mixed marriage where the father is a Jew and the mother is a non-Jew, the child will be a non-Jew, and that's called ki yoser bincha acharecha. Is therefore, let's go back to the case of Bas Aviv Shenolda Mina Akum. Is she called Achosa? But the answer is that she's miyuchas to her non-Jewish mother and not to her Jewish father. And therefore, there's no yichus to the father. She can't be Achosa. And therefore, I don't need a pasuk to teach me that if a Jew marries a non-Jew, the child, the daughter from that marriage is not achos because there's no yichus to the father at all. And we see that from the parsha of Bitchalo Sitein Libno, that there is no yichus, and that's why the Torah says Ki Yasser is Bincha Me'acharad. Omer Avinu Shmami No. From the fact that the Torah says you can't marry, you're not allowed to marry off your son to an aku, to a non-Jewish woman, because Yasser is nechtecha min haderech, that your grandson will not be a Jew. Is let's derive from that ben bitcha bomen avodas kochavim kari bincha. So you married off your daughter to an aku, and she gave birth to a child. Let's call it a ben, whatever, it doesn't matter. So that's called ben bitcha bomen avodas kochavim, meaning it's the son of your daughter, but the father is an oved kochavim, kari bincha. So the Gemara says Lema kasavar avina ove kocham v'eved abba al bas Yisrael avlad kosher. Right, that according to the logic of Ravina, is ben bitcha minha ovedes kochavim is not called what? Is not called bincha. No, I'm sorry. That ben bitcha ba min avodes kochavim is called bincha because the yichus is to the mother. And the mother here is Jewish, right? He married off his Jewish daughter to a non-Jew. But now it sounds like Ravina is telling me that even though the father is not Jewish, the child has a perfectly excellent status as far as Yuchsin is concerned. Doesn't that contradict the opinion that Eved Abal Bas Yisrael have Vlad Mams? So it must be the Ravina holds that Eved Ovei Kochav Eved Shabal Bas Yisrael have Vlad Kosher. So I don't understand, is the Gemara asking a kasha, or this is just a positive statement? The word lema sounds like the Gemara is not happy with this. So Rashi says, "Ulakama and pligi ba b'cholitz." And there's a whole section of Rashi in parentheses. And in the Masifta, which I don't know exactly who he's quoting it, because I don't see this in Rashi at this point, he writes, "Hafil lekahuna hu kosher." He has a non-Jewish father, and there's no psul for kahuna. What does that mean? Ki Yisrael Gomu. One second. What does that mean? Afilu kahuna. Do you follow what he means here? Maybe you have a note on that. Afilu kahuna. Afilu kahuna. That doesn't make any sense. Maybe he had a daughter. That's what he means. Afilu kahuna, and she could marry a Kohen. So we're talking about the father is not Jewish, and he has a relationship with an Ovedes Kochav. I'm sorry, with the Jewish girl. The father's not Jewish, and he has a relationship with a Jewish girl, and there's a Vlad. The Vlad that's born, let's say, is a female. She can marry a Kohen. So the Gemara's not happy with this. Lema, should we assume that Ravina goes as far as to say that even if the father is a guy and the mother is a Jew, the child is an absolute total kosher. Afilu lekahuna. I have someone in my family who married a girl whose father is not Jewish. I mean, today it's very common, right? I'm just thinking, would the daughter of that marriage be allowed to marry a Cohen? Okay, he's not a Cohen, so it's not a problem, but just wondering whether or not. Anyway, the Gemara apparently, again, I'm going to have to borrow you Gemara again just to see. That Gemara really should be in my possession. All the parts, I always take just this one because we did. So I have rights to take it. I just want to see if he also adds business about a Kohen.
he makes reference.
Okay, let's just see. Lema Kasav, shall we say that Ravina maintains that in the case of an idolater who cohabits with a Jewess, Havlad Kosh. Oh, he writes the offspring is unblemished. Let's see what he says about that in the footnote. 37. Let us say that Ravina takes one side of a debate regarding the offspring status. I don't know, it's a little bit obfuscated here. I don't know. Which is there another note that I missed?
I mean,
I was reading this last. Another note? Okay. So the Gemara says that that's not necessarily so. Nehida mamza lo havi, kosher nami lo havi. But rather Yisrael pasul mikri. Again, the child of a marriage between a Jewish woman and a non-Jewish woman, about which Ravina derived the conclusion that the child is called Bincha. What did he mean? The Gemara thought that it's Vlad Kosh, which I think means that if there's a daughter from this marriage, she can marry a Kohen. The Gemara says no. What Ravina meant to exclude was Mamzeris. In other words, the child is kosher l'kol because the child's mother is Jewish. But kosher nami lo havi, but rather he's Yisrael pasul. Oh, so what does that mean, Yisrael pasul? He says in the footnote, in the name of the Ritva, ubekashras ha'isha lekahuna uletruma. Now, I'm not sure what he means by truma here, but let's take kahuna. So kashras ha'isha lekahuna, again, he could have been a lot more pedagogic here, but I think he means that the female child of this marriage is allowed, right? Is the issue is kashrus ha'isha lekahuna? Can the daughter of this marriage be married to kahuna? And the Gemara is establishing kosher lo hav. He's called a pos. She's called a pos. Is there a footnote there on posel mikri that mentions something about marrying her off to a Kohen? No, I don't know what see above means. That really doesn't help me much, especially since I don't have the Gemara that you have in front of me. But if you could look above, you might see something very, very important. Always good to look above. Just tell me what number to say.
Number 17.
Oh, thank you. 17.
So it's on a preview.
He says the following: if the child is a girl, she is forbidden to marry a Kohen or to eat truma. I don't know, this is not so clear to me because he's talking about a girl whose father is a Kohen. I mean, here the girl's father is a Goy. He can't be a Kohen. I don't know any Goy in the world. I never met a Goy who's a Kohen. You hardly meet Jews that are Kohen. Okay.
The next paragraph.
Yeah, that's a little more complicated.
Yeah.
He wants to know if the child is a son, does he passel his wives to Kahuna? Okay, that's already, this is already very, very advanced. You know, we should learn Atzar Yuchsin, which is one of the most challenging programming shots. I tried once to learn Atzar Yuchsin, I didn't do so well. Okay. Now, the Gemara is going back to the case of Achoso min avodas kochov. And we said that she's not Achoso. The Gemara asks, hi, this pasuk, Yosir is bincha me'achorai, and we prove to that that ben bincha habov and avodas kol is not bincha, right? If you married off your son to an avodas kol and there's a child from that marriage, that's not considered your child. B'shiva umos ksiv. How can you derive any conclusions about Yuchsin, meaning the absence, from this particular pasuk of Kiyos's Bincha? The Torah, in its context, is addressing the 7 nations that occupy Palestine. They are excluded. But how do you know that other nations are excluded? Our answer is Kiyosir l'rabos kol hamisirim. So I guess the pasuk could have left out these words Kiyosir. Oh, I see what he's saying. Why did the Torah B'chlal have to tell me Kiyosir? The whole pasuk is there. It says, Bitcha lo siten libno, ubito lo sikach libonecha. Why did the Torah have to give a whole spiel? Oh, you know why? Because Kiyosir is bincha me'achora. So the whole pasuk is coming as a reboot that you shouldn't limit this discussion about the lack of yichsin if the mother is non-Jew to the case of the 7 nations that occupy the land, but it applies to the entire world of Goyim, all umas ha'olam. And how do we know that? Because Kiyosir is bincha is a logic that applies equally to all the other nations, to all the other idolaters, as does the 7 nations. The Gemara says, "Hanicha Rabbi Shimon the Darish time in the Torah, El Rabbanon Minalahu." In other words, Rabbi Shimon is going to say, well, since the Torah gave an explanation as to why you shouldn't marry off your daughter to a non-Jew because the ben will be Yosef, and darshaning that time of the crow, we conclude that it applies to all nations on the face of the earth because they're equally included under Kiyosir. That's fine, according to Rabbi Shimon, who darshans time of the crow. You can derive halachic conclusions from logic. But the Rabbanan hold that ain't darshan time of the crow. We don't have the right to delve into the reason for the Torah, even in a case where the Torah spells out the reason. The halacha requires that any derivation, any conclusion that you derive in the rulings of halacha has to be derived from the Torah. It cannot be derived from a case where the Torah gives you a reason. So if that be the case, then according to the Rabbanim, Kiyosir, second. Again, what's the El Rabbanon Minalu? So I thought Minalu means, how do we know that this Hafkas Yuchsin applies even to the other nations of the world? That's what I thought the Gemara was asking. Well, let's read, he has a commentary here. He says, Halo l'shikasam, according to the Rabbanon, Ki Yosir eno miyuta, shekain lule tam zeh, lo ayinu mechadshim me'atzmenu shezui sibas ha'isur, al kein hutzach ha'kos b'ashmina shezeu tam ha'isur, u'lefichach hu noeg dafka b'shiva amamim shadukim b'yosef. Wow, this is a whole new business here. Let's see Rashi. Shimon the Darish time in the Krav and Perak HaMakabel B'Mitzia. Okay. Go through the whole Isra, Hashavas, Ovot, Bona Aliyah in Ashkenos, Aval Ashira, B'Mashkes, Shkedat Echai, V'Hatz, there's an Alma, Darish time, well, pick it out, Mona, Shemra, Moti Ashira ben Akla. Ochanami, Lidi De Nicha, the Inami lo Farish Kra Taima, the Inami, what we have to underline here, the Inami lo Mefarish Taima the Kra. Time. Have a Dorish time of the Chitur. Ishum Kiyotzer is Pincha. Wow. You hear what we're saying? I thought that Darshina Time Mikra means that we can derive conclusions halachically from the time that the Torah gives. No. He's talking about cases where the time was not written by the Torah, and Rabbi Shimon, with his logic, is going to interpret the time. And if that be the case, then the entire pasuk of Ki Yoser's Bincha is superfluous, because I would have come up with that logic on my own, according to Rabbi Shimon. Is lo itzer kra lefushay time, the yaser kra the yisar lerabel shar mesirim. So it's interesting. The Gemara is now operating with the premise that Dafka the Sheva Amimim, because of their heavy dedication to idol worship, come under Kiyosif. But the other nations of the world, the Protestants, you know what I mean? You know what I mean by that, Calvin? But they're not so from. They won't be macer you and bring you to Avodas Kochab. Right, which is true today. For example, in a mixed marriage, let's say she's not Jewish, she doesn't expect her Jewish husband to come to church. Doesn't demand it. But in the case of the seven Amimim, they are so dedicated to idol worship that they'll require their husbands to come along with them to the temple, to the monastery, to worship the idol. So if we're operating with pure logic, had the Torah not added the words Kiyosar Spincha, then according to Reb Shimon, we would have limited this prohibition of marrying off your son to a non-Jewish woman to the seven nations. Because then it would be. So why did the Torah have to go ahead and say Kiyosar according to Reb Shimon? The answer is L'Rabos, all the other nations. El Rabbanon, but the Rabbanon hold Itzrich Kra, Lifrushe. Time of Zion Umos, Gufayu, Ulimuute Shar Umos. Just 1 second. So since according to the Rabbanon, we don't offer any logical conclusions and derive any speculative explanations for the Torah's prohibitions, and therefore we look into the Torah, and the Torah says something that would teach us that we should limit. Knows exactly the svara of Reb Shimon without the pasuk should be the maskana, the Rabbanon after the pasuk. What was Reb Shimon's haba meaning before the pasuk? That dafka in the case of the seven Amimim, where they're so dedicated to Avodah Zarah, that's where the Torah is going to prohibit, because of the logic of Kiyosah. And the Torah redundantly adds Kiyosah to teach you, no, we're going to expand it. But according to the Rabbanan, that we don't have this operation of using logic. And therefore, we don't know whether or not the Torah would limit it to the seven Amimim. So therefore, when the Torah added Kiyosah's Pincha, it's telling you that only in the case of the seven Amimim is this Isur. He says, "Lebuute shar umos she'enam adukim b'avodas kocham k'mosam." Okay, he quotes the Gemara in Chulin Minig Avosem Yedif. V'lo aiser le ribuya is shar umos minola. So if this pasuk is not extra, it teaches me that svara, that the reason for this Easter and the scope of its application is because of Pen Yosir. Yosir's Bincha, which only applies to the Sheva Amimim, because there are Dukim Lavodas Kochab. It's not just Minig Abusay B'Yadeh. Is therefore we're stuck with the question: how do we know that this prohibition applies even to a non-Jewish woman from the other nations of the world? The Kavase Amrina Sanhedrin Gabi Lo Yarbelo Noshim Lo Yosir Bilvavo. Okay, that's the Isser of a king marrying too many wives. The Rav Shimon Havi Lo Yosir Le Ribuye. To the Lab, Perusha the Kra Havi Darshinu Le Time. Logically, we would have given that same explanation. So the Gemara answers, Man Tana de Poligale, which is the Tana that argues with Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. Right, we know that there's Machlok Shin Chachamim and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. And that anonymous Tana holds that Baal HaChoso is Chayiv Shtayim. Rabbi Shimon, and if Rabbi Shimon is Doresh time of the Kra, then the Kiyasur is completely superfluous. And therefore, he can use the Kiyasir. He can use the Kiyasir for what? For L'Rabos Kol HaMosrim. I have to borrow one more time. Apologize. Who is the Tana who argues with Rabbi Yossi in the Bryce above and presents the view of the rabbis? Rabbi Shimon. On the footnote, he writes, the rabbis needed a verse to teach that the daughter of an idolatress is not considered a chosa. That the daughter of an akum is not considered a chosa, and they need a pasuk for that. And where are they going to derive this halacha from? Because again, there is yichus as an akum, as we discussed. They're going to derive it from Yasser es Luvav. So that's according to the Tana who argues against Rabbi Yossi. Okay, now we're saying that this pasuk of Ki Yasir is teaching me Shar Umos. Shar Mosrim, what he says, right? So again, if you hold like Rabbi Yossi, Yossi has the pasuk of Bas Eches of Bicha, and from that he excluded, he was Memayit Bas Overes Kochav, that she's not a chos. So in that case, the pasuk Yathir is redundant, and we can use it for Shar Umos. Okay, I'm trying to make the calculation here. So now, Montana de Poligal later Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Shimon is the one who could use the pasuk Ki Yasir for Shar Umos because it's an extra pasuk. Therefore, Ki Yasir is going to be Marbe Kol HaMosrim, the other nations of the world. Okay, so that's the Rabbanan of Rabbi Yossi. Right, the Rabbanan of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbanan of Rabbi Yossi are Rabbi Shimon. And that's going to teach us what? Shar Umos. So if that be the case, so that means that in Shar Umos, the same concept of Yosir's Bincha plots, meaning that there's no Yuchsin. See, the reason we get confused is because we keep analyzing Yosef from the perspective of who's going to entice them to worship Avodas Kol. But let's leave that out. Let's just get to the chase, cut to the chase. And that is that Kiyos's bincha means that there's no yuchsin. And that applies to all nations of the world. So therefore, as far as Achoso is concerned, the Rabbanan could derive the exclusion of Achoso in the case of Baal, where the mother is an Avodas Kol for this pasuk of Kiyos's bincha, because those Rabbanan hold like Reb Shimon, that Darshinan, what's it called, time of the Kra, and therefore this pasuk is extra, is superfluous to teach me Shar Umos. And it's telling me that even in Shar Umos, there's no Yichus. And if there's no Yichus, then there's no Erva of Achos. Whereas Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that I cannot derive the psul of Achoso, right? Afkov Achoso. In the case of Ovedes Kol Chaviv, I cannot derive it from Kiyos's bincha because Rabbi Yossi rejects Rabbi Shimon, right? He rejects Rabbi Shimon. If we reject Rabbi Shimon and we're not Dorish time in the Torah, then the pasuk is coming to exclude all the nations. Just 1 second. No. That's not good. Because again, we're trying to justify why Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda needs the pasuk of Bas Eishes Avicha to exclude Achoso min Avodas Kol Chavim. Let me go over this one more time. Banan of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, they don't need the Bas Eishes Avicha to exclude Achoso min Ha'akum, and therefore they use it to add an extra lav in the case of Achoso. Why don't they need the pasuk of Bas Eishes Avicha to exclude Achoso min Avodas Kol Chavim? The answer is because they hold like Rav Shimon that Darshin in time of the Kra, and therefore the pasuk of Kiyos's bincha is completely redundant, and that's going to teach me the halacha that there's no yichus to Avodas Kol Chavim. So that part we have. Now let's go to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda requires the pasuk of Bas Eishes Avicha to derive the conclusion that Achoso Avodas Kol Chavim included in the erva of Achoso. What do they hold? I'm sorry, what does he hold? Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. He accepts a banon of Rabbi Shimon that lo darshin time the Kra, that he doesn't have darshin and time of the Kra. Oh, the total disappointment. What is this footnote? That was 46. Is this footnote 45 relevant to us? The rabbis did not expound the rationale for the edict against intermarriage. Hence, they would not logically distinguish between the various levels of idolatry. And they would derive all of the nations from the 7 nations. Right? We said that according to Reb Shimon, in the logic of Darshin and time of the Kra before the pasuk, we would have differentiated between the 7 nations that are Adukim, the Avodas Kol Chavim, and the rest of the world. Now the pasuk is telling me, no, that all the nations of the world, that's because of Kiyos. Fine. Now we go to the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan say, lo darshina, time of the Kra. They therefore interpret the stated reason for the prohibition. So again, there's no logical distinction now. It's only time of the Kra that you come up with this dre that the Sheva nations are aduki. According to the Chacham who are not Dorish the Kra, then the pasuk here, don't marry off your daughter to a guy, is referring to all goyim on the face of the earth. So why do we need the pasuk Yasser es bincha as an exclusion from the prohibition of those peoples who pose little danger of proselytizing their Jewish spouses, i.e. the nations dwelling outside of Eretz Yisrael that are not fervently idolatrous, as are the 7 nations. Hence, for the rabbis, the verse is not extra. So I guess what's happening is that according to the Rabbanan of Lo Nashina in the time of the Kra, the pasuk of Kiyasus Bincha is necessary. Why is it necessary? They therefore interpret the stated reason for the prohibition, but he will turn your son away as an exclusion from the prohibition of those peoples who pose little danger of proselytizing. So it's mamish a mute. It's mamish a mute. That's a pellet. I don't know how to deal with that, but that's what he says. It's a mute. Now, if you attach that to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, then I don't know to exclude Achosim and Avodas Kochavim from the Erev of Achosim. If I need Eshes, right, Bas Eshes Avicha to exclude Achoso in the case of a Bas Avodas Kochavim. Once I need that pasuk, I don't have an extra lav like the Chachamim do to say that when he has a relationship with his sister, he violates not only one Erev, but 2 Arayos. Not only 1 lav, but 2 lav. Because according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, I need the second lav to teach me this halach of Achosa. And that's because, according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, representing the sheet of the Rabbanan that lo dashit in time of the Kra, I need this pasuk as a miut, which again, I don't know how that works exactly, to exclude the other nations. But according to Rabbi Shimon, and now we're going to identify the Rabbanan of Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi as what? Rabbi Yossi, what's his name again? Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, sorry. I need to, now I'm going to attach the Rabbanan of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda to the Shita of Rabbi Shimon, which means that the pasuk Yasser es bincha is coming to exclude the Shar nations, because logically I would have said that the other nations of the world have a different status. That was the logic, correct? But now the Torah is saying, no, they don't have a different logic, and therefore we can derive the conclusion that there's no yichus to a non-Jewish mother of Eretz Kochavim in all nations of the world. And if that be the case, then there's no Erev of Achosa. B'meila, the pasuk Bas Eshes Avicha is superfluous, and I'm going to use it to derive another law. So the only piece of the puzzle that I'm missing here, which unfortunately he doesn't address, and the sifter disappoints me terribly, is how can we have an exclusion of the other nations of the world? Say anything about that? The inami lo mefarish taima avi dorish taima the chitu mishum kiyasus bincha. Though it's a kral frushi taima, Isaac kra kiyasir the rabos shar masirin. Oh, this is not good. Rashi says explicitly. Oh, but Rashi's talking about Rabbi Shimon. So according to Rabbi Shimon, this is a ribuy of shamis el rabbanon. Is then itzur kra lefushay time of zayin umus kufay lemuute. Rashi says explicitly. It's not Otzka. Rashi says before the wide lines, lemuute shar umos. And then at the end, Rashi says, "Well, Iser Leila Ribuye," and then he writes, "V'shar Umos Minolan." I don't know where does that. What's the answer to that question? Shar Umos Minolan. I don't know. He gives you a whole thing. So I don't know. I can only underline these words in Rashi, Shar Umos Minolan, but I don't see that there's an answer to that. So that's Elul Rabbanon. Just it's in a million. I have to end the ship because of the time framework, but the Urei Rashi were on Chav Gimel, correct? Here. I don't like to end the week with one question hanging here. Albatross here. Chav Gimel, correct? Is that what we're up to? Chav Gimel? Gimel. No, he doesn't have it in the back. Yosef bin Elul Rabbanon. Okay, so that we'll have to leave that. So basically, we're up to the Mishnah on Chav Gimel and Beis. I may, depending on what happens over Shabbos, I may come back to that Rashi at the end, because Rashi says that there's a miyut for Shara Umos, which we saw already in the art scroll. But then he asks for Shara Umos Binol. So how do we know Shara? I mean, you can't tell me that you're allowed to marry off your daughter to a non-Jewish husband. I don't think that's possible. And not only that, he's talking about the Rabban. All right, so we'll have to see if Rashi gives us an answer. All right, then. So I wish you all Shabbat Shalom and thank you very much.